Hi, I'm Scott Powers Houston, and welcome to broadcast number 35. In this broadcast, we're going to be talking about Venezuela, which has been in the news quite a bit lately and seems to be becoming a big problem for Trump administration and for the West in general. And everybody is all up in arms and hates Venezuela, and they're trying to generate a lot of sentiment against Venezuela amongst the people, exactly like they did with Iraq. Okay, so, and what we like to do here is we like to bust false narratives, and you will hear things from me and on these broadcasts that you won't hear anywhere else. Okay, so let's talk about Venezuela. All right, well, before we get into Venezuela, let's get into the main reason why Venezuela is even in the news, or they're even important at all, or why we're even discussing a place like Venezuela. I mean, it's a little country in South America. It's between Colombia and anyway, it's between Colombia, which used to be part of New Granada, that included Panama. Spanish New Granada, and on the other side it's Guinea. I kept thinking about Papua New Guinea, and I was like, no, that's in Asia. But it's Guinea and also Suriname. There's a big, the big countries on the other side, and then Brazil is to the south and to the east. All right, and I was actually in Venezuela in 1994. I was mostly in Caracas, but we traveled all around the region. It's very mountainous. And the people there are lovely, and they were nice to us, and physically very beautiful. And things were fine at that time. I mean, they weren't rich, they weren't bustling economy, but everybody was pretty happy and copacetic, and things seemed to be fine. Traffic, though, was very hard to drive there. People were very crazy drivers. There wasn't a lane drawn in, they would make the lane if they had the small enough of a vehicle. And there was so many cars, in fact, that they had parking garages like I had never seen before, which I've seen since, but at the time it was the first time I've seen parking garages where it was like a tower, and it was like an elevator. So you pulled into like an elevator, and it would come up and dump the car off in a spot in like this big tower. So it was like tall, but it was only like 2 spots. But it was like 8 stories high. I'd never seen parking like that before. It was very strange. But I guess in cities that are crushed together like Caracas is, you have to have that. But it's a sign, I mean, if there's too many cars, it's a sign that, you know, the economy is doing okay. So, especially when it comes to cars. So, what happened to Venezuela? Well, the big issue with Venezuela is oil. And it's all about oil. And it comes down to oil. And there's nothing more to it than that. It's all about oil. Just like Iraq invading Kuwait was all about oil, Venezuela is all about oil. And the only reason anybody cares about Venezuela, the reason why we're threatening to attack Venezuela and not, you know, Uganda, is because of oil. I mean, Idi Amin was a pretty terrible guy, and Charles Taylor in Liberia was a really terrible guy. But we didn't do anything about those guys. So it's not like just because a leader is a bad guy, or he does bad things, or the people don't like him, you know, like the guy, what was the Dobrescu in Romania, that was killing all the, killing everybody in Romania and stuff. I mean, you know, we didn't do anything about that. I mean, there's lots of horrible dictators and bad leaders all around the world throughout recent history that we don't do anything about. So why is Venezuela such a big deal? Well, Venezuela produces 303 billion barrels of oil. That is by far the #1 oil-producing country in the world. #1. In fact, if you take all the barrels that Iraq produces plus all the barrels that Kuwait produces, combine them, which this was the whole reason for Desert Storm 1, the first invasion in Iraq in 1991, those countries combined for 247. Venezuela has 303 billion barrels. What about Russia? 80 billion barrels. What about America? 70 billion barrels. America, 70 billion barrels. A country that really has a high demand for oil, probably the highest demand in the world, and they produce 70 billion barrels. But Venezuela, 303 billion barrels. So quite a difference. And that's the reason why they matter. It's the only reason why they matter. So oil was first discovered in Venezuela in 1914. And in 1922, they discovered what was called the Barroso Gusher. And that's when Venezuela really came onto the map as an oil producer. And in the subsequent decades, they realized that there was a lot more and more and more oil there. So you might think, woohoo, lots of oil, hey, we're rich. Well, not in the eyes of the international community, because the thing is that as they started to get more and more oil, European banks especially, but also America, but even more Europe, because Europe did not have as much oil on their own. They needed from other countries, but Venezuela was a great source, they thought. And so European bankers started to try to, bankers and business concerns, let's say, started to try to make deals with Venezuela in order to secure rights to their oil. And they would buy futures and all kinds of things. I mean, it's a typical thing that happens with all third world developing countries is the big bad West, the big rich bankers from the West come in and they try to exploit their wealth and economic power to coerce a developing country to give up all of its oil rights and oil reserves for, pennies on the dollar. And so while there was all this oil in Venezuela, what they didn't really have was infrastructure and the capacity to be able to mine the oil on their own. So that meant that right away they had to bring in foreign interests to set up mining concerns within Venezuela to get the oil out, to withdraw the oil. And so those concerns mostly came from Europe. A lot of them came from America, wherever, but that's what they had to turn to. And you had leader after leader that was pretty corrupt. And they were lining their own pockets padding their own pockets with money in exchange for selling the oil on the cheap to European banking concerns, basically. And eventually the people started to get wary of that, because they're like, look, even though they were doing all right, they weren't getting rich. I mean, for a country that has the most oil in the entire world, and with oil being like the most important commodity that there is, why are they not a wealthy country? Well, it's because their leaders were very corrupt, and so finally it had enough of that, and they got tired of this right-wing leadership, conservative leadership, that was just doing business with Europe and also America like there was no tomorrow, and they kicked them out. And this guy named Hugo Chavez takes over, who is very liberal. And immediately he decides that he does not want to play ball with Europe and American banking concerns and business concerns. And not only does he not want to sell them his oil for pennies on the dollar, he basically says, this is our oil. It's not your oil. You don't have any rights to it. It's our oil. And so he also did not honor previous deals that were made by previous regimes, where basically they were the business and banking concerns of Europe and America were buying futures. And so all the oil that they were producing in the future, they were supposed to sell to Europe and to America for like pennies on the dollar. Well, Chavez says all those deals were made by corrupt politicians and they are all now null and void. And of course he had the authority to do this. He could say we're not going to pay that stuff. Well, so that immediately brought on a whole lot of sanctions. And the thing is that ultimately at the end of the day you can't beat money. And so Europe and America started to put on heavy sanctions on Chavez. And then they also launched a public media campaign, a PR campaign against Chavez, trying to expose him for being so horrible. And basically they kept associating him with the word socialist, socialism, which in the early 2000s or after the 1990s, America needed to create new villains in the world, or the West needed to create new villains in the world. So the Soviet Union is no longer a villain, but so now instead of communism, let's equate something else with communism. Let's call it socialism. And anybody on the left they'll call them socialists, and so they're the new commies that are destroying the world, and we have to fight against these commies so they don't destroy the world and destroy American values and destroy American freedom, those commies. And so they have to create a new enemy. And so that's what they did with Chavez. But Chavez was pretty clever, and he was able to keep things copacetic, basically, and the people pretty much liked him. And so one of the things that Chavez did was he decided to, and Chavez took over in 2002. By the way, so we're talking about 2002. So one of the things that Chavez did was, so around the same time that Russia becomes not a threat anymore, China starts developing. And as they start developing, they start to need a lot more oil. And China doesn't really have a oil source for oil, and it's a big problem. So they've got this huge country, and they've got lots of rare earths, we know that now, but they don't have much oil, in fact, really no oil. And so they were dependent upon getting oil from other sources. And they were trying to hedge against this or counterbalance the trade imbalance that they were looking at possibly having a big trade imbalance by creating this manufacturing mecca in China. And the way, and I've discussed already how they did that. So they manipulate the value of their currency so that in real money, it's not much money that the people in China are getting paid, but relative to China, they're doing fine. And so that's how they're manipulating economics, which is kind of unfair, but and it's not enough of a problem to create a war about, but that's how they were trying to offset the imbalance of the fact that they had to get oil, more and more and more increasing demand for oil from other parts of the world. And the first place where they wanted to get that was Kazakhstan. And basically, so Kazakhstan was a developing new country that had been part of the Soviet Union, and they were just getting their footing and trying to reestablish themselves. And they were largely a Muslim country. So right away, China gets their mitts and their paws on Kuwaiti oil. And the way that they do that is or not Kuwait, Kazakhstan, sorry. The way that they do that is that in Kazakhstan, there's like 25 ruling families. So like 25 families own all the money in Kazakhstan. And so all you have to do is bribe a few of the families and make it worth their while, and then suddenly, ta-da, all the oil is available to China, and they completely dominate Kazakhstan. And in the same time, also help Kazakhstan to develop and grow significantly, and their economy did pretty well, actually, by playing ball with China, selling their oil pretty cheap to China, but, you know, they were also spreading the wealth around, and so it was a little bit similar to how Venezuela was, let's say, in the 90s. And so that was doing fine, but actually Kazakhstan, as much oil as they have, wasn't enough. And so China started to go to Africa and try to dominate Africa, but not so much oil in Africa necessarily. Lots of other resources, especially for making bauxite, for making aluminum. They got into that too. But, you know, not so much oil. But who has oil was Venezuela. And so immediately what Chavez and China just did shortly after Chavez took over was they started to negotiate deals, and Chavez started selling his oil to China. And China was a huge source of, as far as a big customer. And China was paying, you know, reasonable prices for this oil too. But you know, it was a win-win situation because it wasn't that expensive. They were getting their oil Venezuela was getting resources. And so under Chavez, things were dodgy, rough. He suffered a huge media blitz against him. He's a socialist. This socialist is doing all these terrible things as socialists always do, these commie socialists. But the people were basically happy under him. And so when he started to be in ill health and then he eventually passed away, the hope was that there would be a more conservative leadership taking over. But that didn't happen. Instead, he just passed the baton on to Maduro, who unfortunately is not nearly as clever as Chavez, and he's a lot more draconian, which is a big problem. And Maduro now, he's a real hardline socialist. He started out as a bus driver. He was part of a union, a very powerful union in Venezuela. And so he's very pro-union, pro-worker, very pro-socialism. And so, again, media blitz and double down on the sanctions. So the sanctions were bad on Chavez, but on Maduro, they doubled down on the sanctions. They really made it basically impossible for him to move money at all. And so it kind of made Maduro dependent now on the Chinese, and the Chinese knew that he was dependent on them now because the only way that he could do business now was like with the Chinese yuan and stuff, and he couldn't even trade in dollars. They limited his ability to be able to get dollars, and so he's buying into this Chinese yuan as being like an international currency, which it's not because it's not free floating and you can't trade it on Forex, but they try to intimidate struggling countries such as Zimbabwe and Venezuela. And so it's like the China dollar instead of the petrodollar, you know. And so they're trying to get Venezuela to sell their oil cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, which they succeeded in doing. And so the economy in Venezuela started to get bad under Maduro, and it wasn't really his fault. And he's trying to do what he can to make it better, but at the end of the day, the economy is getting bad, and so people are getting disgruntled because they're like, look, we have all this oil, and in the 90s we weren't doing that great, but now we're really not doing that great 20 years later, so we're really against Maduro. And so they tried to overthrow him. And of course this overthrow was largely sponsored by America and European interests. And they put all this money into attempts to overthrow Maduro. Because they were like, yeah, people, yeah, get upset, yeah, get angry, yeah, the hell with Maduro, yeah, he's bad. So Maduro responded by being very draconian and very Stalin-like and cracking down really ruthlessly on the people now. And then ultimately he changed the constitution, basically he got rid of elections and he became a dictator. And he became a Stalin-esque type dictator. Now, that leads me to talk a little bit about Stalin, which I'm going to do a broadcast eventually on Stalin altogether. But suffice to say, Stalin is actually not that bad and is portrayed in a very negative way by the Western media again, and by history books published in the West, say that Stalin was just this horrible, horrible guy. Actually, he was not that horrible, and he was good in a lot of ways. He was just, communist. So Maduro is likened now as like Stalin. And then, of course, the West has such a bad image of Russia, right? In Russia, it's always, every day, there's always snowing. So the image to the West is that it snows every day in Russia. Well, it doesn't. In some parts of Russia, it's like near Sochi. Remember the Olympics were there. It's quite nice year-round. And there's some areas where there's quite fertile also. So like in the southern parts, to the east of the Caucasus, that area. Obviously Russia's not that bleak, not that poor, not that, but actually they are poor. They rather, in general, the average Russian is not real rich. But there's a lot of people in Russia there that do have money. Starting in 1990, actually, they got rid of communism, and there's a few entrepreneurs, business people, that became very wealthy. And now those places, people are dominating places like Pattaya in Thailand. There's like a whole Russian section, like half the town is owned by the Russians now. Places like that. They are attracted to places like that for various reasons. But anyway, and it's more than just that it's a nice warm climate in the wintertime. Which of course is important to a Russian, right? But anyway, but this image of Russia and the image of Russians as being these brutal, ruthless, you know, boy, if you're in trouble with the Russian, oh, they'll just pound you and kill you in a second, and they're heartless and ruthless and not even think twice about just shooting anybody, just shooting people for fun. They're just, they'll just shoot you and would beat you up. And all Russians, even today in movies, are always depicted as the bad guys. You know, they're the really badass, ruthless people are the Russians. Yeah, they're bad. Always depicted in this way. And I got to tell you that personally, with my Russian friends that I've had, they've been nothing but good to me. And they're wonderful people, and they've done whatever they could do to help me. And there was a time when actually I didn't even do what they paid me to do. And there were various reasons for that, but at the end of the day, I didn't do what they paid me in advance to do. And you would think, oh, you would never want to do that with Russians. Oh my God, they'll kill you. No, there was no threat of that. What they did about it was nothing. They did nothing. They didn't hurt me. They didn't threaten me. They did nothing. They just didn't employ me to do that kind of work anymore. But they didn't hurt me or threaten me, and they were still my friends, and they still invited me to their parties. And there was no hard feelings, and actually very big of them, actually, you know, morally big of them to be that way. And in fact, when I needed help a little bit later on, they still tried to help me. So they were still my legitimate good friends. And this is how Russians really are. So anyway, let's get back to Venezuela and the Venezuelan people. So Maduro, you know, he is a little bit draconian. So now also the narrative is all these drug boats that are coming from supposedly Venezuela. That Venezuela is the main producer of cocaine and the main producer of fentanyl. Well, first of all, Venezuela has nothing to do with fentanyl. Fentanyl mostly comes from Mexico. It also comes from China. And I guess in a roundabout way, they're saying that they're dealing with China, and so in that way fentanyl is getting to Venezuela, but that's actually not really happening. Fentanyl has nothing to do with Venezuela, and if they're really worried about cocaine, the #1 supplier of cocaine is Colombia. And also all these boats that they're blowing out of the water and are killing everybody on board, actually all of those boats are on their way to Europe or to China. They're not on their way to America. They're not bringing drugs to America. They're not on the way to America. Now, why does, and so, okay, so another thing I wanted to mention. So Maduro has basically been a dictator since 2018. He successfully basically eliminated constitutional elections. And now he's just a dictator. Okay, so now what's happening is now they're saying that he's a drug dealer and he's sending all his drugs to America. That's not happening. He's still doing business with China primarily, but the sanctions now, they're tripling down on the sanctions, and so things are getting bad in Venezuela. The shelves are getting empty, and the people are starting to rebel. As the West, and when I say the West, I'm talking about America, Western Europe, Australia, places like that. When I say that, so that's the West. So not all of them are actually in the West, but that's what I mean by the West. So they are tripling down on all of these sanctions, even worse than Russia. And actually, if they could make them sell their oil to Europe, which they're not doing, they could also eliminate Europe's need to get oil from Russia. And if no need to deal with Russia with oil, then you can triple down on the sanctions against Russia too, and probably end the Iraq War. But there's no such problem with Venezuela, because they're not selling their oil to Europe either. So they are tripling down now on the sanctions on Venezuela and trying to economically cripple them as much as they can. And so And now we're sitting around troops, and we're trying to paint him as this bad guy like Stalin or like Saddam Hussein. And now Saddam Hussein murdered 100,000 Kurds in the northern part of his country. Maduro has done nothing like that. He has not murdered hundreds of thousands of people. But we're still painting him as this bad guy. And eventually, I guess we're going to have a war against Venezuela, which is all because of oil. And it's all about oil. Make no mistake, it's 100% about oil. And if Maduro was smart, actually, he would probably just realize that you cannot beat big money. It's impossible. Today, in today's world, big money wins 100% of the way. And there's nothing you can do about it. And if he would suddenly just say, you know what, I'm going to have a meeting with Trump, we're going to make a negotiation, and I'm going to sell a bunch of oil to America cheap, and a bunch of oil to Europe cheap, so they don't need to get oil from Russia anymore. And if he just suddenly decided to do that, he would become a darling of the West. And we would support his regime and be, just like we supported the people the guy in Iran. What was his name? That the Shah overthrew. No, the Shah of Iran. That's it. The Shah overthrew, and the Ayatollah overthrew him. Yeah. So the Shah of Iran. So we supported him and actually put him in power in 1953. So he would suddenly, miraculously become this media darling, and everybody would just love Maduro, and Trump and Maduro would be like that. Yeah, he's my bud, because Maduro is finally deciding to sell oil to America and to Europe for pennies on the dollar. And so the false narrative here is that people think that we need to go, that the reason why Venezuela is not doing well is because of socialism. But the real reason why Venezuela is not doing well is because of sanctions that are being put on by the West that completely cripple their ability to be able to move money around and do business with anybody else, with any other country other than China, really. And so that's the reason. And it's all because of oil. 100%. Like I said, 303 billion barrels compared to 70 in America, 80 in Russia, like 140 in Iraq. The real producer for oil is Venezuela. That's why we're going to have a war with them, because we want their oil. And if they're not going to give it to us, then we'll attack them for it. And that's what is being prepped up to do. Okay, so I guess that about covers everything about Maduro and Venezuela. So again, this was episode 35. Please stay tuned for future broadcasts where I will do the 2000 BC broadcast, and I will do some broadcasts on some other historical and socioeconomic topics. But this is a socioeconomic topic that's current, and it's an issue that's happening right now today, so that's why I decided to talk about Venezuela right now. All right, so that about wraps it up. Please like, share, tell your friends about it, and subscribe. And we'll see you next time right here at the same Bat channel. This is Learning with Power. I'm Scott Powers Houston. You have a great day. Thanks.